Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to see so many of you here. I think we have a sellout, which is absolutely as it should be, given the pertinence of our subject matter this evening, whichever way you stand. And of course, given our dazzling array of guests. I can't think of four better, more eloquent women to talk on this subject for us. As we've heard, it's hard to imagine or believe that it was only 5 months ago that Me Too as a hashtag came into public discourse. But importantly, it existed long before that. It was founded by Tarana Burke in Selma, Alabama, 2 decades before, to help women who had experienced sexual abuse. But it was the tweet of a Hollywood actress, Alyssa Milano, response to allegations of abuse by Harvey Weinstein, that really hit a nerve. She called on actresses, she called on everybody, she called on women to use Me Too as a hashtag, and within a week, 1.7 million times the phrase had been taken up on Twitter, 12 million on Facebook within 24 hours. And you don't need me to tell you what an incredible life that hashtag has had since. It's swept through the world, it's swept through sectors, it's taken out many careers in its path. But tonight we want to look at what sort of a movement is Me Too. Is it a movement? Is it just a moment? And what life does it have beyond the hashtag? Does it have a life beyond the hashtag? We've called the debate Me Too has gone too far, but perhaps you can also add to that the idea that Me Too has gone nowhere at all, that it has achieved nothing of substance. Has Me Too galvanized women? Has it empowered them, given them the courage, provided solidarity so they can speak out and speak up? Or has it reinforced a stereotype of women as powerless or as helpless victims? Is it more of a vacuous phrase than something of meaning? And have we entered a world of trial by Twitter rather than investigative journalism and perhaps innocent until proven guilty? Anyway, let me introduce our brilliant speakers who are going to talk through all of these things. We have, for the motion, Me Too has gone too far, or Me Too hasn't achieved enough or anything of substance, the feminist and writer Germaine Greer, and the Times columnist Melanie Phillips. More round of applause. And against the motion, Baroness Helena Kennedy, QC, and the founder of the Women's Inequality Party, Sophie Walker. I've already spoken far too much, but I have to just tell you how the evening is going to work very quickly. Each of our speakers will set out their stall in an opening statement of around 10 to 12 minutes. Then I will read out the result of the pre-vote that I hope you all made when you came into the room. Then it will be over to you for Q&A, so please do have your questions at the ready, and please keep them concise and to the point, because we really want to get through as many as possible. Then we'll have our closing statements from our speakers, and then if all goes to plan, I will have the results of the final vote. And the point is that you have open minds, malleable minds, and are prepared to change them, because we want to see if there's a difference between your vote when you came in and your vote after you've heard our speakers. So without any more from me, no more instructions, let me invite our first speaker, Germaine Greer, to the stage. To the podium.
I really feel I have to tell you that I desperately hope to be the last speaker today, because I live in a world where rape and the overbearing of women's autonomy is not something that is confined to Hollywood or even to New York, but something that happens every day. Let me give you an example. I have a good friend who I've known for 50 years, who has been happily married for a long time and had lots of children, and the children are all married and the family is a big success and so on. But I remember a time not so long ago when we were both visitors in a country house party in Kent. Now, don't try and work out who this is, because nearly every clue I give you is wrong. But what happened here is that we'd had a lovely dinner, we'd had lots of conversation, we were probably fairly pissed, and we all went to bed. And a few hours later, I think about 2, I was wakened up by shouts. "No, Rupert! Get off! Leave me alone! What are you... No, no, no!" And I thought, oh my, what do I do? And of course, like most guests, I did nothing. And it went on for a while, and then somebody fell out of bed. And then there was a quieter sound of creaking bed springs, and it was over. Now, you'll be surprised to learn that not very long ago, I asked her about this event. And I said, "Do you remember that night?" And she said, "Yes, but it wasn't very special. It happened fairly often." She said, was that rape? And I said, "Well, I don't know. It might have been." And then I said to her, "But would you have wanted your husband sent away for 7 years for overriding your unwillingness?" And I didn't ask even further. I didn't say, "Did you give in because you were embarrassed about waking up the whole house instead of just me?" I didn't ask those questions. And I still don't know. But why would you send your husband away for 7 years, which is the tariff for rape, because he overrode your unwillingness on such and such an occasion? There is no way that the law of rape fits the reality of women's lives. We are told by Quentin Tarantino, who else would guess, that rape is a bloody, violent, dreadful crime. No, it's not. It's Davy. It's David, I meant to say, not Davy. It's a David thing. It's a domestic thing. It's something that just happens when you don't understand each other terribly well and when you don't feel like making space. Sex is a blood sport. People take punishment. They get over it. The relationship survives or it doesn't. That all of this brouhaha about what's happening with movie moguls when they have gorgeous young women introduced into their hotel rooms and come out with their bathrobes on is really neither here nor there. If you want to do something to rescue women who are being ground down in a daily relationship, who are feeling humiliated, devalued, not cared for, punished, then you're going to have to be a bit smarter about all of this. It's got nothing to do with the anguish of real life. If we want to rescue the relationships between men and women in heterosexual relationships in particular, then we're going to have to try a whole lot harder. One of the things that's been going on that has gone under the radar during all of this nonsense about what is happening with movie moguls and so on is what's been happening on American campuses. We know that 1 in 5 women on an American campus will be subject to some sort of sexual abuse in her time in the college. This has been the truth since the 1980s, and nothing has changed that statistic. Now, why is this? And what is happening now? So we got a DCL, a Dear Colleague letter that came from the Obama administration saying that universities had to investigate claims of sexual abuse coming from the student body. And they had to keep these strictly confidential, and they had to arrive at a verdict, and the object of the exercise was to stop sexual abuse on campus. Did it work? No, it didn't. How could it? What was argued in the case was that you didn't take the same weight of proof that you would use in a criminal prosecution. You would accept a balance of probability, a POE, the prevalence of evidence. Why would you reduce the amount of proof you needed in a case involving an undergraduate who is likely to be thrown out of his college, but ironically not even end up in the hands of the law? Wouldn't even go to the police, even though we now know from new evidence from Callisto, which is a new software program that is being now adopted by 13 American universities. And I feel a bit peculiar about this, because when I was teaching at Warwick the last time round, I really thought we should bring this in, because I became aware that certain sexual predators were doing all the damage to my student undergraduates. I knew who they were. I knew I could do nothing about it. But what's happened now with Callisto is you can make a confidential report which will be encrypted, which can't be read by anybody else, which will go to the person, the organization, I'm a bit vague about this bit and a bit worried about it, who are overseeing this whole thing. And the amazing thing is that they will match a report made by a student of abuse that she has suffered at the hands of one of her colleagues. They will match that to other reports already held. And what has come out of that? Something that doesn't surprise me, but it might surprise you, that something like 90% of the offenses, of the experiences that have been explained and described in the accounts, 90% of them have been carried out by 6% of the men named. Now, I was fairly aware that the predators were a specific group of people. I was fairly aware that most of the young men at my university wouldn't have known what end was up. They could never have done this. They could never have preyed on the women, seduced the women, then had sex with the women, and then dumped them, which is what really, really hurt, and what caused, as far as I was concerned as their teacher, the worst kind of damage. So the interesting thing there is, of course, that that information is confidential, and the conditions under which, under the DCL, that this was made available to the universities was that they had to remain confidential. So the minute you decided to out your rapist, it was all a mess. Now, what happened there is in the case of Emma Sulovich, who tried to get her college to take action against the man who inflicted anal intercourse upon her when she begged him to stop. It began as a consensual arrangement. It then turned wrong, went bad. She tried to get out. It didn't work. We don't have the whole story, and I think there's much more to it than we will ever hear. But she then was informed by the college that there was no case for the young man to answer. So she decided to begin a heroic campaign against him. And what she did was carry a mattress. I don't know why I'm saying these strange words. There is clearly some strange bird hovering over me, but a mattress. 50-pound mattress, which she dragged all over the university, and it was part of her visual arts thesis for her final year that this was her art activity, and it was to do with this poor young man whose name had been published all over the place, and who actually, but this is the really bitter part, all the rules having been broken in her valiant protest against being abused by him and having him get away with it, they all ended up with him being paid damages by the university because his career had been adversely affected by her campaign against him and by the university's apparent cooperation in this protest. We can't do it this way. We can't do it by lessening the burden of proof, by making our sons, people, it's odd, isn't it? We always think we identify with women. We are also the mothers of men and boys. We really don't want them to be so vulnerable in a university situation. So if we then retreat into the real world, we have to think, how can we get our sons and daughters to understand each other better? Because what happens in a rape allegation is that you have two narratives. You have the woman's narrative and the boy's narrative, and they don't match. She says she didn't give consent. He says he's convinced that she did. And it's really hard to work out what to do next. We shouldn't be there. But one of the odd things about the Obama law was that you couldn't have mediation. Now, speaking as an old lady who thinks, I'd like to see a reduction of damage in this case. The boy got it wrong, she got it wrong. Can we have them talk to each other? The first thing that was outlawed by the Obama letter, by the DCL, was mediation. It was considered too traumatic, so they wouldn't do it. So where do we go from there? Litigation in Columbia University between the two sides continues to this day, and it will continue for years. And the only people who would make money, and you won't be surprised to hear this, are the lawyers. There will be no healing of the wounds, and there will be no repairing of the career of the young man who was found not guilty twice, but has been judged guilty by popular opinion. This is not how we run the state. This won't work.
Thank you very much, Germaine Greer. And our second speaker for the evening, Baroness Helena Kennedy, if you could take to the podium, your little microphone issues. Thank you very much.
Well, Germaine, you may be saying that Me Too has gone too far, but I'm saying it hasn't gone far enough. And I want to say to all women, especially to older women, that we owe it to the young to support them in their clamor for justice. And it's one that most of us must share too, and decent men do as well. And it's much more than about actresses and the casting couch, and it's much more than being about hands on knees and dubious comments about big tits and banter, as it's called. It's about much, much more. This Me Too campaign covers a whole range of conduct, from catcalling in the streets to the breast juggling that parliamentarians subject their women colleagues to the sticking of cocks against women's behinds on the buses and on tubes, to the humiliation and degradation of foul abuse that women are subjected to in social situations, on the internet and social media. And it's about women being told things that are so painful, that they're ugly cows, that they're pigs with lipstick, that they're cunts who deserve to be raped or dead. And I'm telling you, any woman who puts her head above the parapet, she finds that she is subjected to that on the internet. And it's about the automatic sense of entitlement, which Germaine has just spoken about, that some young men feel when it comes to sex. And so that something that may seem mutual and consensual turns into something else when he wants something as part of the sexual repertoire that the young woman is saying no to. And it's very, very hard to secure any kind of conviction once some kind of consent was given to intimacy. And I see it in our universities, because I too am there. And it's really time that men old enough to be the fathers of women who want sex in return for promotions or advancements or some other opportunity that they can bestow because of their power, they have to get real and stop it. And something had to happen to call it out. This is also about unequal pay, and it's not just about in the BBC, it's about everywhere else too. And it's about men slapping their partners because their dinner isn't on the table on time. It's about footballers forcing sex on women without their consent and enforcing their silence with court orders or contractual orders in which they're not allowed to speak, but they take compensation. It's about a world which pretends that there is equality when there isn't. And it's about the failure of the justice system to deliver justice for women. And we have to recognize that. And I don't want to see injustice perpetrated on men, but I can tell you, if you want to start talking about failures of justice, let's address the failure of justice for women. And then we might be able to have a holistic system that is going to be just for everybody. Just think about the fact that 2 women a week are killed by their partners. One call a minute to the police is about domestic violence, and the vast majority of it perpetrated against women. Abysmal conviction rates, as you've heard, in relation to rape. So if we want to talk about injustice, let's start there. And about the fact that boys as young as 12 now are being exposed to pornography, floods of it on their phones, porn that carries depictions of women that in turn they then expect young women to carry out for them, giving them blowjobs and servicing them as though there's no mutuality in sexual enjoyment. Is it any wonder that women are held in low regard by young men? Consider the way the internet adds to the misery of girls and women, commenting on them and bullying them and disgracing them and humiliating them, and the business of revenge porn, and the blackmailing of young women with indiscreet photographs that are taken in times when women thought they were having relationships. The high level of self-harm and depression amongst the young, but especially amongst girls, is overwhelming. Low self-esteem endemic. So I want girls to be angry and to demand change. And I want boys and men to be angry on their behalf and to insist on something different too. The Harvey Weinstein horror show burst a whole dam. But as sure as eggs, I knew that there would be a backlash. And it always fills me with sadness when women join that backlash. And it makes them part of the hegemony that holds the status quo in place. Power is coded male, and we have to change that. And we can do it together. It's important to remember that this clamor of voices has been growing. And as you heard, it started in the United States decades ago with a black woman making the call for justice for women. And isn't it shocking that there isn't a black woman on this panel? Because black women suffer this indignity too. But it didn't start in this country just when film stars complained about it. We've been having a swell of this, and it started with the lids coming off scandals in churches, in children's homes, in secure units, in hospitals, the whole shocking BBC business of Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris and other celebrities using their fame as covers for their abuse. And for year upon year, women and young people have complained to the authorities. They actually complained to the authorities, but were dismissed and silenced. And then there was the scandal of Rotherham and Oxford and Manchester and Newcastle, those cities where many girls were groomed, hundreds of them, really vulnerable adolescent girls, and then violated, and the police and social services chose to ignore the complaints because they were dealing with white trash, young women who were unworthy of protection, girls whom they said were making a lifestyle choice. Then there's been the business recently of war boys, up to 100 cases of being drugged but he ends up charged with 1 rape and a small number of assaults because the woman couldn't be relied upon when they said that they had experienced something strange happening to them. And now we hear that he is about to be released. Millennia, women have been made to feel shame when they have been the people at the receiving end of abuse. And they've been told that whatever happens to them is their fault, and it's they who are blamed. And that is the power of patriarchy. Male dominance is maintained by this stuff, and women are made to feel soiled. They absorb feelings of guilt. The voice in their head is mouthing the cultural norms created by men and sold to women. And it must have been something about me that made this happen to me. And that's what women end up feeling. The woman whom Germaine says she'd heard calling out, "No, no, don't do this to me." And she said, "Was that rape?" Because, of course, she's persuaded that it's not rape when it's happening with your long-term partner. But at long last, women have found their voices, and I feel exhilarated, and I'm thrilled that young women are calling out behavior that blights their lives. And if we're going to get to a place where men and women together, treated as equals, have good relationships, work alongside each other in the great way that that can be and so productive, sexual misconduct has to stop. And of course there's a difference between gross violation like rape and other violent sexual assault and sexual harassment. And it's very distinct from the squeezing of your behind or the constant sleazy remarks. Of course there are distinctions. No one is suggesting there is an equivalence between these things. But they all live in the same soup in which women's inequality is suspended. It's all about the culture. And that's really what Germaine was describing. It's about a culture. And it's a continuum. And so it may be the small stuff may seem so minimal, but in fact, if you don't call out the small stuff, you don't change cultures. It's a continuum which eats away at our sense of freedom. And women of my generation learned survival mechanisms, avoidance techniques, self-safeguarding, and we ran around tables, and we walked on by, and we rushed off, and we pretended that constant comments on our physicality meant nothing to us, and we hid our hurt. We got rid of unwanted attention by saying that we had to get home, or we had our periods, or we just accepted it. And then we showered and scrubbed to rid ourselves of the memory. Women should not have to do this. A whole new generation are saying enough, and I am thrilled that they're saying enough. And the fact that it started with famous female actors has given courage to many other women. And the fact that women at the BBC have made a fuss about unequal pay also is giving courage to women in other workplaces. And the fact that women in Parliament say, "I don't want to be groped," and resent that they're expected to make nice because they want to be an MP, and they call it out, gives courage to women in factories and sweatshops who are expected to give a blowjob in the stockroom if they want to get overtime, or if they want to have time off, if they want to spend a weekend with their kids. This is not about spoiled, wimpy, snowflake women. So when young women here stand up and say no, they are being courageous, and it gives courage to women elsewhere to organize and demand their rights. Every small act of resistance has meaning. Women in Egypt have invoked Me Too. Women in China, they have been challenging the ways in which this has gone on. Women in India have just come back from Jaipur. Women in India are also on the warpath, stirred by this campaign, stirred by it, and stirred when it's even about small things because they put up with these indignities daily. Women are on the march, and we should all be excited about it. And instead of sitting on the sidelines and bemoaning a younger generation, we should all be supporting it. It breaks my heart to hear women, older women, who think I don't know what it is, whether it's about having absorbed male think, dismiss that generation as they are seizing upon a new way of thinking about the future. I see at the back of the hall, spiritual words, "He hath put a new song in my mouth." Well, she is now putting a new song in our mouths, many of these young women who are saying what happens to them. And so, of course, we want to call for due process and proportionality. And of course, I'm a lawyer. I don't want to see a lessening of the standards of proof, but I do want us to cheer on women who are standing up and feeling emboldened by what is taking place. Many of us were too dismissive of gross behavior. I remember going up to Scotland and my mother saying, "What are you here for?" And I said, "I'm speaking at a conference on women and the law, and it's on sexual harassment, Mum." And she says to my aunt, my mother was 80 at the time, my aunt was 70, and she says to my aunt, "She's here to talk about sexual harassment, Isa." And my aunt says, "I was on the bus just last week, and a man put his hand up my skirt." And my mother said, "Not the nice Jaeger skirt you bought in the sales." So, There was no doubt women had to put up with it. And you blotted out male bad behavior with that kind of thing. Germaine, you were an iconic woman to women in the late 60s and 70s, brave and outrageous and fabulous. And you shocked the old. And you told women to taste their own menstrual blood and to get in touch with their own bodies. And you told them to go out and get as many orgasms as they could. And you talked about female sexuality in a way that made the establishment cringe and wail. And there were men and women who thought you were a disgrace, that you were going overboard, you were going too far. And we defended you to the core because we felt inspired by you. And I knew that we all wanted the same things, a better, more equal world. And we may all express it differently, and we may all have come at it in different ways. And the journey is all the same. We're all traveling in the same direction to make a better world. And so I'm disappointed that you're not standing firm on saying that to this new wave of feminists that you are with them. And you should be. And as for you, Melanie, well, I remember you. I remember you too when you were a young feminist once. I don't know what happened along the road, but something's happened to your compass. And all I would say is that we should be showing the same generosity of spirit to others who also want to end discrimination and violence. This movement is about wanting a better world for men and women. And actually, sex is better, I tell you guys, if it's equal. And there is a common humanity in what we're struggling for. It's about wanting equality and respect between men and women. And we should be excited that the baton is being passed. We're on our way off the stage, we older women, but a new generation will make the change happen. And they'll make it happen because this has meaning. But we have to support them in it, men and women both. I'm with them all the way.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Right, we have to move on to our third speaker now of the evening, Melanie Phillips.
Good evening, everybody. Well, I suppose I'm the backlash. It's very nice of Baroness Kennedy, a woman without power, to try and restore my reputation by recalling me to my more idealistic youth. I believe that I am still a feminist. I simply define it differently. I have a slightly different perspective from my esteemed colleague Germaine, because I actually support the idea that Me Too has gone too far. Let me, before there's any misunderstanding, say, if it needs to be said, that I most certainly disapprove of rape, sexual assault of any kind, louche behavior, unwanted sexual advances, abuse of any sort of, at all. And there is no argument in my mind that there are examples of discrimination against women, and no argument that men, both powerful men and ordinary men, behave very badly towards some women. The argument that I'm making, however, is that the protest that started by the unmasking of Harvey Weinstein has simply gone too far. My point is that on the back of undoubtedly serious or even criminal sexual misbehavior by some powerful men, Me Too has become a movement to demonize men in general as brutish and oppressive, and present women in general as their victims. And I want to make 3 points in support of my argument: a point about disproportion, a point about complicity, and a point about hypocrisy. So let me dive in with disproportion. It is good, I am pleased, that men who have apparently sexually attacked or harassed women in the workplace, whether in starry workplaces or not, should have stepped down. But we're not talking, when we talk about whether Me Too has gone too far, we're not talking only about rape or assault or harassment. I'm sure, I would hope, we all agree that rape should be prosecuted. It is one of the most serious crimes there is and is rightly regarded as so. My argument, and the argument behind the motion, has Me Too gone too far, is that it's gone far beyond that. Men are being pilloried for groping or flirting, putting their arm around a shoulder or up a skirt, leering, or just wolf whistles. This behavior undoubtedly may be ill-judged, boorish, pathetic, wrong, stupid, but surely it should not be lumped in with rape as proof of collective female victimhood. An example, making a pass at somebody now gets you on the sex offender register. Not long ago, a man put his arm around a female friend, she was distracted apparently by a wasp's nest, and kissed her on the shoulder and the head. She pulled away, he apologized. She reported him to the police. He first denied, and then he admitted sexual assault. He was given a conditional discharge, and he was told to sign the sex offenders register. The judge said, quote, "This was an impulsive act. You've had a very serious lesson taught to you. You do not make advances towards women who don't want you to." Now, what he did was wrong, but was what happened to him really a proportionate response? I would suggest that unwanted advances happen all the time. Men on women, women on men, men on men, women on women. Are we really entering a world in which we are going to criminalize all inappropriate behavior? Once upon a time, women would have known what to do with that kind of behavior. They would have either verbally or physically made sure that the man understood that his advances were not wanted. But apparently that is no longer the case. We are all victims now. That's proportion or disproportion. Complicity. What we're talking about in most of these cases is unquestionably disgusting or reprehensible behavior. But what we have been seeing at the most, what has got the most attention is behavior that men have got away with because women colluded. Now, this provokes uproar, this idea that women are somehow complicit in what's happened to them, because it is said to be blaming the victim. So let's look at blaming the victim. This claim of blaming the victim is a pernicious get-out-of-jail-free card for taking no responsibility at all for what you do and for infantilizing women, the very last thing that feminism should be doing. Look at the recent uproar over the President's Club, the charity event where, you may recall, scantily clad hostesses were allegedly groped and subjected to other louche behavior. Now, the President's Club, by all reported accounts, was unbelievably revolting. And I am very glad that it appears to have been shut down. It was disgusting. But the women involved, some of them were indeed very upset at what they were subjected to. But most of them knew what kind of event this was. There were reports in the press that when these women hostesses arrived, they were handed dresses to wear which revealed rather a lot of them. It was quite obvious what role they were going to play, even more obvious when they were asked or made to sign non-disclosure agreements. This is all terrible. Does it mean those women were victims? Are we really saying that women are so incapable that they were unable to decide for themselves that they would not wear those dresses, they would not sign those non-disclosure agreements, they would not take part in this kind of event? The assumption you see is that all women are being victimized. Now, this is simply not true. When you look at the Hollywood scandals, the harassment and victimization of women in Hollywood, some of those who were involved in these events knew about these men in advance. Harvey Weinstein, for example, others in a position of great power over their careers. And these women made a calculation, in many cases, to go along with it in order to advance their careers. For example, Uma Thurman. who said that Weinstein made unwanted, degrading, and unpleasant sexual advances towards her at the Savoy Hotel and in Paris in 1994, claims which Weinstein has denied. But she said nothing at the time, and there were photographs taken of her subsequently, in subsequent years, companionably socializing with him as late as 2016. People like that, I believe, provided Weinstein and others with cover for their bad behavior. Now, you could say, well, these women were intimidated. Well, I agree. It does happen that people are intimidated in certain situations where a person in power of your life is behaving inappropriately. It happens in all walks of life. But surely there comes a point where you can't say, I had no option but to go along with this. I mean, how many of you would submit to sexual harassment or attack to keep your job? If this happened to you, wouldn't you possibly decide that such a job was not for you after all? Wouldn't you complain to somebody in authority or go to the police? Wouldn't you tell your friends about what had happened to you? And if you did tell your friends, isn't it likely that your friends would not decide to present themselves to the same man for a job, as happened over and over again in Hollywood, where apparently everyone knew about Weinstein and others? And why does everybody assume, why are we supposed to assume that every woman who claims to be a victim is telling the truth? Many men who have been accused in this tsunami of claims of harassment or attack or violence, many men are subject to these claims which are unproved, yet Me Too assumes that they are all true. The accusation is tantamount to a declaration or a revelation of guilt. Guilt not only of the individual man, but of all men. This assumption of female victimhood leads to injustice. We're told all the time, for example, that rape convictions in this country are said to be too low. Too low? By what standard can the rate of convictions be too low? Only by the standard of somebody who assumes that everyone who is accused of rape is actually guilty. Otherwise, it makes no sense that rape convictions are too low. In other words, when it comes to rape, the presumption of innocence is reversed. Helena talks about justice for women. I want justice for women, but in this case, I believe women are lending their name to injustice. And from where I'm coming from, that is not what feminism was ever about. The fact that sometimes there are ambiguous signals in sexual relations between men and women as a result of our permissive culture, or the fact that sometimes the woman, as one judge said recently, and my goodness, she was pilloried by other women for saying so, that sometimes the woman involved is too drunk to know what was happening, these things are brushed aside. The idea the woman has any responsibility for what may happen to her is considered to be is considered to be a backlash, a betrayal, not feminist. We're not sisters if we say that. The assumption is that all men who are accused of rape are guilty and all women accusing them are telling the truth. So in addition to the female victims of real rape and assault, we now have an increasing number of male victims of women's false allegations, an injustice which has destroyed these men's lives. Oliver Mears, an Oxford student, cleared of rape after spending 2 years on bail. Liam Allen, a criminology student accused of rape. Police had failed to disclose texts from a woman that proved his innocence. So many of these cases of injustice against men in rape cases have there been that the Crown Prosecution Service has decided to review all cases of rape and sexual assault to find out how many more men it has wrongfully put on trial. My argument is that the assumption that all women are victims, which has led to miscarriages of justice against men, is undermining the measures needed to deal with real rape that takes place. Sexual harassment, it takes place, it is wrong, it should be dealt with condignly. But is it endemic, as we now hear? The University of Chicago's General Social Survey asked a random sample of American women in 2014 whether they'd been sexually harassed by anyone while working in the previous 12 months. 3.6% said yes, down from 6% in 2002. Of course there is violence against women, but many domestic violence statistics are exaggerated. No time to go into the methodological flaws involved in many of them, and we never hear about women's violence against men. But the most reputable studies have shown over the years that when it comes to the violence initiated against another person in a domestic setting, the number of times that that violence is initiated is actually as much by women as men, if not more so. This whole idea of women's victimhood presents women as helpless, incapable of standing up for themselves. Isn't that precisely what feminism is supposed to be about? Helena says, power is coded male. Really? I don't recognize this world. In the world I live in, men and women are capable of abusing power and do so. Let's look at hypocrisy. We have had stellar examples of hypocrisy at the Golden Globes and the other Hollywood events, where we have women in dresses in black making a statement, dresses which plunge to here and are slashed to here, using their sexuality to protest against being regarded as sexual objects. What they are saying by wearing these dresses is, does my conscience look big enough in this? These women have had stellar careers and made fortunes from being treated as sex objects. Did we hear a protest, Me Too protest, from Uma Thurman when in 1995 she was chosen by Empire magazine as one of the 100 sexiest stars in film history? Or in 2013 when GQ magazine named her as one of the 100 hottest women of the 21st century? I must have missed it. And many of these women only suddenly discovered their consciences about the endemic nature of sexual assault and harassment in Hollywood when Harvey Weinstein became no longer able to be useful to them. I was very glad when Helena said what she said about women in India and China, because until this moment, I don't think I'd heard anyone in Me Too talk about women in the developing world. Certainly, there has been no equivalent protest, equivalent to Me Too, to protest at the treatment of women in the developing world. No Me Too type protest to protest about women under Sharia law, female genital mutilation, stoned to death. No protest in support of the Iranian women who day by day are ripping off their headscarves in Iran and putting their lives on the line to get rid of the regime that oppresses them. And no one, as far as I know, in the Me Too movement in Britain or anywhere else, has said anything in support of a Me Too nature about the fate of the thousands of poor young white girls in Rotherham and in Telford who were pimped and raped and assaulted and enslaved. Nothing. Instead, there is this claim of endemic and institutionalized injustice and violence against the women of the West, who are in fact the most free, the most independent, the most educated, and the richest women in the world today and in the history of the human race. In my view, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, Me Too is simply about striking poses, literally wearing badges, proclaiming the wearer's virtue, about claiming the mantle of victimhood in order to demonize men, spread hatred against men, and make themselves as women morally untouchable. It's about taking the most uncharitable view possible of human behavior, male behavior, any behavior other than their own. It is about vanity, arrogance, and abuse of power. Me Too is very, very well named. It is not about fighting oppression or injustice or attack. For Western women in the Me Too protest, it's all about me. It has set back the cause of women and the cause of justice, which in my view, it should be one and the same cause. Well, I don't say Me Too. I say not in my name.
Sophie. Ladies and gentlemen, our final speaker, the leader of the Women's Equality Party, Sophie Walker.
Melanie, you really should have told us how you really felt. If I had £1 for every time I've been asked to debate the effectiveness of the women's movement with other women, while men continue to make all the main decisions, I'd be living on my own private island by now with the funds to plot my own takeover of the patriarchy. The day we don't have to debate feminism's need to exist is the day it has succeeded. So if you ask me, has Me Too gone too far? I have to respond, are you kidding? Let's consider the scale of the task. First of all, Me Too is challenging entrenched messages about individual responsibility. Women live our entire lives being told that the barriers we face are of our own making and ours alone to lift. We absorb this like the air we breathe. At college, we tie ourselves in knots to get straight A's, to be the perfect friend, to have the perfect body, and still we walk out on graduation to an immediate pay gap. At work, we are assigned mentors, on the understanding that being female means we somehow innately lack the capacity to get ahead. When we don't get the pay rise, when our ideas are ignored or stolen, we are offered resilience training to better bear up under the strain of being female. When we have children, we are expected to take on most of the care for no money in exchange for manuals on how to be the perfect mother. When our relationships break down, we are sold DVDs to get that sexy body again. And when all of that evades us, we take advice on how to eat clean, or do yogas, or run marathons. Guilty. When we are raped, our police ask us, what did you do to bring this on yourself? When we are sexually harassed, society says, are you sure you're not overreacting? Why did you not say anything until now? The idea that other feminists would ask women those same questions is profoundly sad. But we are all programmed to do this to a greater or lesser extent by a lifetime of being told all of the above. And so the most powerful way to explode the myth of individual responsibility is simply to stand beside another woman and say, me too. It is the start of collective organizing. And it is in collective organizing that women find strength. But collective organizing also means dismantling the barriers that women face when they simply seek to stand side by side with other women. And that is why Me Too started on the internet. And in doing so, it challenges another set of ideas about what activism is, and in particular, who is allowed to call themselves an activist. Now, there are some older feminists who believe that internet activism is less real. It requires less commitment. A hashtag's a cop-out. You don't have to show up in person. Well, look who showed up tonight. It's very lovely to see you all. But really, look at this all-white panel of middle-class women, batting ideas back and forth, playing intellectual chess for the enjoyment of a predominantly white, mainly middle-class audience. A debate about equality played to win the debate rather than the equality. For an audience that can afford the ticket price, that can afford the childcare, that can afford the time. Do you want to tell Tarana Burke that Me Too has gone too far? The activist who used it as an expression of solidarity for the victims of abuse with whom she has worked for years and years with little money, little help, little appreciation. She's not here tonight. She's often not mentioned in discussions about Me Too. She is black. There are plenty of women not here tonight
women at the margins of this movement, women whose choices are stifled, who are trapped and punished by being born the wrong race, the wrong class, as well as the wrong sex. Women from minority, ethnic, or working class backgrounds who could never see themselves walking into a forum like this because it is so white, because they haven't been asked, because they would likely not be understood. Women who are disabled and have to map every move outside of their homes in terms of accessible transport and exhausting effort. Women who provide care unseen and unpaid and are impoverished because of it. Women who can't afford the tickets or the childcare or the time for debates. But they can access the internet, whether it's via a phone or a computer in their local library, whose first barriers are those of isolation and loneliness, as were mine when I was a carer to a disabled child locked in my home, who become activists first as part of an online community who are saying, "Me too," because they have realized that no one is coming to their rescue and it's on them to rescue themselves, for whom pressing send is the first break in their chains. Is there anything more powerful than that? And whose messages short-circuit an internet built by and for men, where algorithms are written by 18-year-old boys, while women are told they are too stupid to understand the technology. Of course we understand it. It's the latest manifestation of the oppression that marks the rest of our lives. The tweets threatening to rape us, the Facebook threads abusing us, the Snapchat exchanges where classroom gossip and coerced naked selfies are currency for blackmail. In a world where support at Twitter offers no support at all, you reported a tweet threatening to tie you up and make you drink bleach. We find no action required. Me Too says we defy the patriarchy's attempts to use technology now to intimidate and silence us. Typing Me Too is a moment of self-declaration that opens the gates to the sisterhood. And as Me Too works its way through the layers of our institutions, it reveals the scale of women's inequality to those who would debate it still. Me Too started in the media and entertainment industries, bastions of male power that tell stories of male power, to create and sustain a culture where women are presented as fodder for sex, for service, for subjugation. And Me Too went next to politics, where men vastly outnumber women and legislate for the protection of their own privilege, where female politicians and staff and journalists are there for sex, for service, for subjugation. Me Too went to the charity sector next, where supposedly good men think it's okay to rent out the insides of women's bodies, where development agencies arrive in ruined lands and men see in starving, destitute women opportunities for sex, for service, for subjugation. Me Too has so much further to go in terms of collective consciousness raising, the storytelling upon which the feminism of the 1970s was based, and in terms of revealing the structural inequality we must demolish, in revealing that this is not about sex at all, but about power and women's lack of it. It's been 6 months since Me Too started. That makes it about time for a backlash. Fine, bring it. Progress is never linear. And backlashes give us the strength to double down, to hone our skills, to prepare for the next push. Because the third and the biggest challenge that Me Too has to address now is the idea that women who join this movement are victims. That women who say Me Too are rolling over, seeking their own personal authentication. Again, I have to ask, are you kidding? Have you seen what the media does to any woman at all, let alone a woman who accuses a powerful man of sexual harassment and violence? They are ripped to shreds. They are depicted as one alone, no matter how many of them, a series of unhinged individuals to make their experience and this movement small. And it is only when victims of sexual harassment come forward that commentators care about rape. It is only in this context that rape becomes important. What was it? Real rape, as a means to grade all other experiences and find them wanting. And as long as we don't understand and care about sexual harassment, we will never understand and care about rape. And so while editors scan social media for shots of the accusers in their swimwear or having a drink, you're drunk, your fault, they will stitch through the narrative of the unhinged woman another one that is just as persuasive. That all women have achieved sexual liberation and it's game on. Or, as Melanie put it in a recent Times article, women have torn up the old sexual order in order to behave with as much sexual license as men. We benefit from being presented as sexual objects. Men misinterpret the signals, all because there aren't any rules. Now, I'm running out of time, so I have limited time to point out all the flaws in this argument. One is that men do not harass or rape anyone who can fire them. They know perfectly well what the game is here. Another one is that women can just complain and leave a job where they are harassed. What privilege reeks from that argument? Tell that to the woman on a 0-hours contract whose benefits have been cut and whose childcare is precarious. Another is that the destigmatization of sex has not liberated us. It has been co-opted by the patriarchy as a way to ensure that women continue to be enslaved by sex by insisting on our constant availability, judging us solely by our fuckability, by conditioning us to believe that any power we have resides solely in how we wield our sexuality. Or as Germaine put it in her book, Sex and Destiny, that consumer-oriented recreational sex is all. And that is not sexual liberation, it is sexual commercialization. And the thing is, we know it. We know it, but for so long we chose not to look at it because we absorbed all that fakery about individual choice, about being strong. Oh my God, strong women. It's no coincidence that the ideal of the strong woman emerged as more women suddenly started to protest about this daily battering. Male screenwriters suddenly started talking about the importance of a strong female character who could fight back, preferably in a corset, and shame the rest of us who whinged. Me Too is the demand that we look and that we be freed from the demand to be sexual at all times. Has Me Too done enough? No. But it has begun a mass rejection that we should ask for permission to revolt. That we have to be the right kind of feminist. That being a Western feminist automatically means you don't care about your global sisters. You want feminist foreign policy, you get more feminists into Westminster. It has become a mass rejection that standing up to sexist bully boys is the action of a victim. The next phase of Me Too will fully show what this movement means, and it is women side by side speaking to each other. When one woman is singled out for abuse, another will stand up, and most importantly, for her. Me Too is not the whimper of a victim. It doesn't mean poor me. Me Too is the roar of a gladiator, and it means I am Spartacus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed to all our brilliant speakers. So I'm now going to read the result of the vote that you made when you came in. The question you were asked, has Me Too gone too far? 248 of you said yes, it has. 457 of you said no, it hasn't. And 210 of you are waiting to make up your minds. You don't know. So now we've got roving mics. I'm going to try and take a couple or 3 questions at a time. So if you raise your hands really high, someone there. And please keep your questions as tight as possible because we did start late and we want to try and get them in before our closing statements. Yes. There.
Hi, thank you very much. So I want to ask a question. Basically, I want to ask, you two have given like wonderful things about this question, and I want to ask your practical approach to this. I'm 19 and hope to pursue a career in politics. I'm aware that in Parliament and Westminster, there's a mass sexual harassment situation. What is your approach if I want to gain my career and go higher and further in it? What if my boss does something that I feel uncomfortable with, puts his hand up my skirt or touches my breast?
Okay.
I may be middle class, I am privileged in so many ways, but I'm also a woman. How am I supposed to deal with that? Am I just supposed to accept it and say if I want to carry on or go further in this? Or am I supposed to, there's no outside body
Thank
that I
you
can
very much.
complain
I think
to?
so. That's to Melanie and Germaine. We'll come back to you. What are you supposed to do? And this lady here.
Katie McKinnon said recently wrote recently in the New York Times that the Me Too movement has gone where the law has not been able to, and she implied that was a good thing. Are there any changes to the law in this country or in another country that you would like to see?
Thank you very much. And we'll take one more before we answer them. Yeah. Is there somebody who can get to the... Okay.
Thank you. Liz Bosley. I would like to just make an observation to the young lady who asked, how do you cope with this? I'm Glaswegian, as you may tell from my accent. I've been an oil trader for 40 years. Most sexual abuse happens in private. How I've been dealing with it for the last 40 years, although less frequently recently, is the direct approach. There is nothing that pulls up someone's attention as quickly as a quick rattle round the chops when they do it.
Let me bring you to your question.
My question is, how do we get back to the situation where we don't have to worry about the political correctness of direct action because it's the only thing that works?
Right. Okay. So the first question from the lady at the back, I think to you two, what is she meant to do if...
Why are you even asking us this question? I mean, the obvious thing to do, if somebody puts his hand up your skirt, is to punch him, get rid of him. I mean, for God's sake, what are we pretending here? I mean, I can remember a long time ago when people gave a damn what I did with my private parts. I auditioned for a show on the BBC. And at the end of this, it was an interview, which was hopeless. I didn't want the job anyway. And as I was leaving, this creep, who I think was probably on a pretty good salary at the BBC, sidled up to me, pushed up against me and said, "Give me a kiss." And I said, putting an edge on my voice that went round television centre, "Why would I want to kiss you?" End of story. I mean, what's going on here? Why do we suddenly become so timid that people put their hands inside our clothes and we ask for help? Help, help. The Holy Ghost is not coming.
I have a young woman at Oxford just now who was in a club in Oxford, and when a young man started fondling her behind and putting his hand into the back of her trousers, she caught his hand and she held it up and said, "Do not touch me when I don't want it." He punched her in the jaw, and she broke her jaw, and she ended up in hospital. And so don't tell me that you can easily deal with things automatically, physically.
Let's move to the question of this lady here.
I want to say
asking about
just
changes to the law.
Yes, I want to deal with that. I want to say, first of all, to my Glaswegian sister, that of course, I too was brought up in the direct action field. But it can carry risks for women, and women know that, and they know that some men are just going to be violent. I want to deal with the business about, is Catherine McKinnon's line that Me Too has gone to where the law has failed to go? And to some extent, I think there is some truth in that. That because women are feeling the great sense of failure by law, they're saying, right, if the law's not going to do for it, we're just going to call people out, because nobody else is doing it. And what I want to say is, I want men to be calling out other men when they're doing it. Really. You know, and I say this as I'm married to a fabulous man. I have 2 great sons and a daughter. And let me tell you, around our kitchen table, we talk about all this stuff. And all I can say is, I have said to them all, I hope you will call out shit when it's happening to women, because too often it doesn't happen. I remember when I was young being interviewed about sexual harassment, because I'd written about it, and I was interviewed on a radio thing, and we're going back to when I was in my 30s, and it was early days for us trying to make change. And so the interviewer said to me, have you ever been sexually harassed yourself? And I said, yes, it happened in the law, and of course it happened. I didn't name names, but I said that it had happened to me, it happens to many young women in the law. And do you know what happened? I went into the Old Bailey the next day, and I'm in the Baroness, what we call the place where you have coffee if you are a barrister. And we went into the Baroness, and I go over to get my coffee, and this table, a posse of men with, sitting there, man-spreading, and then one of them says to me, what's all this business about sexual harassment? And I said, I was in the chambers, and I mentioned a particularly pervy old QC, and he said to me, he can get any woman he wants in Annabelle's, why would he harass you? Right? So I was humiliated in a room which was probably 90% men. And so that's what is done to women when they complain. That is what's done. And when men stay silent, when that kind of humiliation is happening to women, it is just not good enough. And so I'm saying to you as men, you have to come and stand up for women in this arena. You have to help us change the culture, because that's what we're asking for, a change in the culture, a change in attitudes.
I'm going to take 3 more questions from the floor. Someone down here whose friend is trying to stop him from asking the question.
Hi, I'm John, and one of the few men here and a fantastic supporter of the Me Too movement. The big IT companies are entering sort of phase 2 or 3 of their life now, where they're going to be regulated because of their immense freedom and promiscuity in all sorts of ways. Sophie, particularly to you, how do you see the next phase of the Me Too movement developing in the light of that?
Okay.
I'm sorry,
let's take 2 more questions, and then we'll go to that. This gentleman here in the second row, can you get? Sorry, it's a bit of a workout for our. Thank you.
Would our panel agree that Me Too is not exactly equivalent to the women's suffragette movement, or indeed International Women's Day, which it appears to have hijacked?
Thank you. Yep, let's take one more from the back.
For 6 months, I was an examiner at the British Board of Film Classification, and 25% of what I had to examine and put out for purchase was hardcore porn. That's R18, not implied sex 18, but hardcore porn. I was also meant to put out 15 films, i.e. films at 15, which was slash and burn, at classification 15, and I wanted them out at 18. And for that, I had to resign and was almost sacked. Now, my point I'm making is that the commodification of attacks on women through pornography or violence was rife in the film world because it increased audiences. So my question is about commodification of sex and women within this neoliberal society. And my question is the Me Too movement going in the right direction? Is it about the right things?
Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go to the first question. First question for Sophie about the next phase, what you see as the next phase.
I want to answer all of those, but I'll be really fast.
I'm
going to link this question to the last point here, which was, like, how do you punch back someone who is posting revenge porn? How do you punch someone who's, like, harassing and abusing you on Twitter? How do you punch someone who's saying, I want to make... the one I get a lot is, I'm going to put you in a burqa and tie you up, and then you'll be sorry. You feminist. You feminist. I'm also from Glasgow, I get a bit punchy as well. But I never do it. But I think the point is, in terms of where IT goes next, there's a fascinating report out tomorrow by Amnesty, which I urge you all to read, because we've contributed some marvelous stuff to it. And I think that speaks a lot about where we need to go next. For us, it's about, there's practical stuff, like you need a big red reporting button, right? It is almost impossibly difficult to report sexual violence, sexual abuse online. It's incredibly difficult. It takes up huge amounts of time for this sort of out-of-office thing that pings back saying, oh, we found nothing to look at here. So in terms of being easier reporting, and also in terms of internet companies being forced to be transparent about the number of, the amount of reporting they get and their response to that reporting is absolutely vital. But we keep making this small. Like Me Too and violence against women is cause and consequence of women's inequality. And we're not going to stop that until we see the bigger picture, which goes to what you're saying at the back about a career in politics. Join the Women's Equality Party. Do the structural stuff. That's how we stop this. I mean, all of this is about detail and it's about small, and we've got to look at the big picture. It's all violence against women. And equality in the media is one of our core policies, because the commodification of women in media has got to stop. It fuels violence against women. Similarly, we are the only political party in this country that is a pro-Nordic model, that wants to end demand, that wants to stop the prostitution of women, because it is only when we take that sort of action in the understanding of the mass structural inequality that we face that we can stop all forms of violence against women.
I want to come to the question about the suffragettes. I know you've written about this, Melanie. Can you perhaps answer this gentleman here? How do you think Me Too compares to other things, Women's Day, the suffragette movement?
Well, at the most obvious level, there's no comparison, because the situation of women is beyond comparison with the suffragettes of the 19th century, the suffragist movement. I mean, then, you know, what they were fighting against was real political and sexual inferiority. They were denied education, they were denied entry into the professions, into the universities, and there was a sexual double standard. What was considered de rigueur and normal and acceptable and inevitable for men in terms of sexual promiscuity was deemed to be completely unacceptable amongst the women who serviced them, and the women were punished and the men were not. So it was a completely different situation. On the other hand, there were some remarkable similarities, because the women's movement, we think of the suffragettes as being all about, you know, getting the vote. But in fact, the women's movement of the 19th century was much more complex than that, and covered a range of social issues, and very much like today, involved women fighting other women over the same kind of agenda. So you had, for example, some women who thought that prostitution was the expression of women's freedom, and you had many others who thought that prostitution was the expression of women's enslavement, and so on and so forth. Some women wanted androgyny. They wanted to write men not just out of the social script, but out of the biological and genetic script altogether. You had some who were envisaging asexual reproduction in order to perpetuate a universe involving only women. And Christabel Pankhurst was absolutely convinced that men were the source of disease for women throughout Britain, and basically had to be stamped out. And so I find many similarities with the feminism of today.
Okay. We started a little bit late, so forgive me, we're going to finish a bit late too, and it's too compelling to end early. So I'm going to take 2 more questions, then we'll have our brief closing statements, and then we'll hear the end. So yeah, let's go to this lady there.
When the actual percentage of false reporting for rape is so low, why are we prioritizing men's reputations over women's experiences?
Why are we prioritizing men's reputations over women's experiences? One more question. This will be the last one. Is it? Yeah, let's go to that gentleman in the back row there.
What do you ladies plan to do with men? You know? What is our future?
Thank you very much. That will be a perfect last question. Thank you. Okay, so the first one is open to anyone. Why are we prioritizing reputation over...
Well,
Helena. And I've got to keep them brief.
It goes back to the thing that I was saying, which is that, you know, if we're going to be talking about justice here, and we're really concerned about the idea of naming and shaming certain people who've abused, then, you know, let's just put it in the context of the great injustices that women have been experiencing for too long. And I say this as a woman who practices in the law. We still have serious problems around this, and it's attitudinal. It's about shifting the way in which perspectives operate in the courtrooms if we want to see justice for women. And that's part of the problem. It's about the way in which people see things. And of course, women learn male think. I would say to you, Melanie's one of those people, you know, who's learned to see the world in the way that it's been portrayed to us. It's about a socialization where you learn it and you embody it and you end up thinking that way too. I don't believe in demonizing men, and I just want to say to my friend over there, when you're asking what's going to happen to men, I love men, don't I? I just, you know, you'll have plenty of space in my world, I promise you. All I'm saying is we want a different kind of relationship between men and women, and we don't want it to be based on this sub-undercurrent, which is about seeing women as being lesser. That still feeds into the way in which people think.
I would like to just answer that question. What do you plan to do with men? I'm going to ask them very nicely to stop expecting the feminist movement to center them.
Okay, Germaine, and then we're going to move on to the closing speeches. What should we do with men now?
Well, we have an interesting relationship with men. We are their mothers. And we always forget this in these conversations. We talk about them as sexual antagonists and as possible partners and so on. And we talk about getting better, easier convictions when it comes to protests against their behavior. And we would feel quite different, you know, if we were suddenly told that the burden of proof in a rape case had been lightened so we could get more convictions, because as everybody knows, we get hardly any after an enormous amount of expenditure of energy on the part of the police. But if it was your son, would you be happy to discover that the burden of proof had been lightened? I would argue, yes, do that if you want, but then think about lightening the tariff. Why does a man who is accused of attempted rape, I mean, what all these words mean is now totally impenetrable. If you look over the whole world spectrum of what is sexual offense, it's completely confusing, as given the case of Sweden, in which they actually have 3 times as many rapes as anywhere else in Europe, mainly because they have a different system of classifying what actually happens. We really don't know what's going on, and that's partly because it has never been an issue, really. Women haven't been the issue. It's been men who were the issue and the men who owned women. As far as I'm concerned, one thing we have to do is ditch this ancient inheritance of rape law and arrive at a sensible sexual assault law, perhaps, and arrive at a way of damage limitation. Instead of sending people away for years and years, instead of destroying families, instead of creating a whole criminal class, let's find out how we can get to understand each other better and offend each other less.
Okay.
We don't understand each other. That's the problem.
Thank you very much. So now we come to our closing statements. So each speaker has a very brief chance to give their closing statement, and we're going to start off with Baroness Helena Kennedy.
2 minutes.
2 or less.
I'm told this has to be an absolutely short, sharp burst. So all I want to say is, this is not about demonizing men. This is not about putting somehow a pointer in their direction and saying that there's no place for them. That's just silly. This is about recognizing that just like votes for women and that great wave of feminism, and then the wave of feminism that took place in the 70s, we're seeing a new wave of feminism, and we should be welcoming it. Because with each new wave, you get a shift, and you get differences taking place, and the tectonic plates shift. And to my young woman up there who said, can I have a career in politics? You most certainly can. And what we're trying to do is to create systems which will make it impossible for people to, with impunity, put their hand up the skirts of young women politicians and make their lives a misery. That has to stop in every workplace, whether it's parliament or the factory floor. Women must be treated properly and with dignity, and in their common humanity be protected. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is we're really talking about cultural change, and that's what's being called out. A culture, a soup in which this stuff exists and is allowed to exist. And if we can change the culture, it means that we have to talk about the lesser things along with the great, huge things. We have to talk about the common experience that girls from an early age learn, which is that they have to be self-protective, they have to safeguard themselves, that they're going to be blamed if something goes wrong. And that has to stop. And it's about re-engineering our society, re-engineering it in a way that benefits men and women equally. And it's about our common humanity. For me, this is an issue of human rights, that women's rights are human rights, and it's about protecting everybody, men and women, not lowering standards, Germaine, keeping the standards high, but everybody respecting each other. And that's the cultural change we're trying to make now, and that's what young women are calling for. And I support them, and I hope you will too.
Thank you. And next, Melanie Phillips.
Helena asked at the beginning what happened to me, that I turned from being a real human being into the she-wolf of the Western Hemisphere. And what happened to me was that I thought that the people on my side, which was on the side of justice and responsibility, I came to the conclusion that they were on the other side. And I find it sad that Helena, who I respect very greatly, does not see enough to call out the great injustice being done to men who are being unjustly accused of rape. She says that it's not about demonizing men. In my book, anyone who says the rape convictions are not high enough is actually doing precisely that, because the assumption is inescapable that men who are accused of rape are inevitably guilty, and the presumption, therefore, is that when it comes to the accusation of male crime against women, the presumption of innocence is turned on its head. And for me, feminism is about justice, and that is inimical to justice. I also don't recognize this picture that we've been painted by Sophie this evening, that oppression marks our lives, that we're living in a patriarchy. My goodness me, that takes me back, that word patriarchy. We are living in a patriarchy, are we? Well, I've lived through a couple of decades in which men have progressively been told they are absolutely useless, that all the male attributes in which they took pride, such as courage and strength and valor and all that kind of stuff, was simply a synonym for oppression against women, because we all know that men are violent and brutish. I do recall a feminist pamphlet many years ago entitled, "Would You Take One Home With You?" And the one that one would not take home with you was, of course, a man, any man, because men were basically useless and worse. In my view, men in the last 2 or 3 decades have been turned into very little more than sperm donors, walking wallets, and occasional au pairs. A gentleman asked, where to now after Me Too? I would suggest there's only one way for men to go now, and it's castration.
Right, okay. And now, Sophie Walker with your closing statement.
I'm going to let you into a secret. We're not really debating Me Too tonight. Or rather, what we're debating doesn't just go by the name of Me Too, because one of its other names is feminism. And feminism is the most exciting political ideology there is, for 2 reasons. One is that it is the only system that designs for the furthest first and understands that the furthest are always women. And 2, because it challenges itself constantly. It learns and it changes and it moves and it becomes stronger, and it allows for women to say, I am a feminist, although I disagree with some other feminists. It allows for an understanding that just calling yourself a feminist takes up space, and that the more of us call ourselves feminists, the more of us take up space, and that is the most alarming prospect for the patriarchy. That, and being an optimistic feminist, which is even more terrifying. Because the strength of our resistance is in our linked arms. And so I link arms with every woman on this stage, no matter where they stand in this argument, because we are all feminists. Germaine, I disagree with your arguments tonight, but when it comes to fighting for women's liberation, I will always stand beside you, and I will always say, Me Too. You've got your closing speech. Yeah. Don't worry, we haven't forgotten. It's now your closing speech, Germaine Greer.
I would have been perfectly happy to be rolled over here because I'm the oldest. But there is a thing we haven't talked about that has always concerned me, which is feminists are not man-haters. Life would be so much easier if we were. Our problem is that we love men. We give birth to them, and I'm afraid to say that in many cases we like our sons better than our daughters. We have to be kind of quiet about that. But it's because of this disproportion. It's because we need men more than I think they need us. We say they're homosocial. Their principal source of emotional satisfaction is their relationships with other men. And we're not in that situation. We love them. We are in love with them, and we are vulnerable to them. Now, somehow, we have to fix that disproportion. We have to achieve some sort of symmetry here. We have to escape from something we haven't mentioned all night, but it's been lurking in this room, and that is misogyny. I don't just mean the fact that men don't like us a terrible lot, it's that we don't like each other. And this is the really challenging proposition before us. How can we care more for our sisters? How can we build the same kind of resistant social structures that men build? How can we actually face the problem of male hegemony, male power? How can we manage if we can't build sinew between us, if we can't resist, if we can be shattered by their attack, if we can be divided from each other?
You're really on our side. You know,
I've never been on any other side.
Just bring your chair round.
We're all together. There's no separation here. There was... Yes,
Bring your chair round.
Love going on.
yes, but we're not at Cambridge or Oxford, and we don't believe in debating, and we don't think there are two sides to every question.
That's true. So that's the... So I think our wonderful assistants are still bringing the final vote. I haven't quite got it yet, so I'm just going to ask, while I wait for it, I think it's very nearly there. I haven't done this part. I think you haven't taken the votes from these guys. So just while we wait for that final vote, is there anything you've heard this evening from over this side that's convinced you or that swayed you slightly from your argument?
No. No, but it saddens me to hear Melanie being so vitriolic, because I do find that when I spend time with women, I don't find this sort of sense of rage against young women who are, arguing for a fairer world. And I just think that you're getting this wrong, Melanie, and it saddens me to hear you saying it. I just think that you're wrong in your description of our world, of the demonizing of men. It's not true.
I'm sad that you're sad, Helena. But it does strike me as a little curious that because you disagree with me, I become vitriolic. And I think that speaks volumes, I'm afraid, for your position. And it does explain why I so sadden you by not being the person that you once thought I was.
Okay, right. So still waiting for that final vote. I could have let our speakers give much longer final statements, which means I could just take one question shouted very loudly from the floor, because we probably, our mic, yes, could you just this one last question while the vote comes in, and can you speak very loudly because we've lost the mics?
Yeah, just for Melanie's benefit, I would like you to know that I believe it's a Crown Prosecution Service inquiry that happened recently as 2013 that showed that false rape claims are at about 4%, which is commensurate with any other claim for false claim for crimes. So the idea that we are somehow demonizing men, that we are over-prosecuting men, is ludicrous.
It's not true. Yeah, it's not true. Can't we just have a show of hands?
I think I have the piece of paper. Yay! Thank you very, very much. Okay, so just a reminder, the votes when you came in, Me Too has gone too far. 248 of you said yes, 457 of you said no, and 210 of you didn't know. At the end of the evening, Me Too has gone too far, 162. Me Too, I don't know if it's gone too far or not, only 29. And no, 710. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very, very, very much for coming. Sorry we've run over. Thank you to our brilliant speakers. Thank you very, very much.